So I have bachelor's degrees in molecular biology and chemical engineering. So Blue Biosciences is Europe's first and currently only cultivated seafood company. So I hope that by the time this book is published, we're in good company. It's more in showing up in Europe. So we're actually working on growing fish cells without the animal. So we're growing just the cells with the intent of producing meat. Something that was really compelling for me when I decided to join Blue was how much experience our founders actually already had in fish cell culture. So our founder, Sebastian Rakers, had a whole career at the Fraunhofer Institute for Marine Biology. And in his career, he developed fish cell lines from many different fish species, and many of those were actually inherited by the company. So what was really cool to me about this company was that right from the outset, we could start thinking about the product development because we already have the cell basis. So we can already start to take those cells and try to integrate them from this sort of raw cell product into a seafood product that you'd really like to eat. So that was quite fascinating for me. And also it allows us as a company to sort of iterate through both the food production and the food technology and product development side and the cell culture and bioprocess side, saying, okay, well, what can we do in the cell culture? What can we do in the bioprocess that actually gives us the best and tastiest fish? And how can we make those changes while still maintaining a really efficient bioprocess? Right now, as I mentioned, at Blue Biosciences, we're working on multiple levels of the cultivated seafood production pipeline. So the first level is actually generating, or actually sort of obtaining cells from an animal initially, taking those cells and growing them in a way that they can be sustained in a laboratory environment, sort of allowing them to maintain their ability to proliferate over long periods of time, and then also to differentiate into different cell types that might be specifically necessary for meat. So we're thinking mostly of muscle and fat. So this is the first part. And then the second part is sort of getting the biomass of these cells up to a sufficient number that you're able to have enough in hand that you can start to make sort of foods out of them. And this is also an area where we're working on actively. Our food science team works very, very closely with our cell biology and cell bioprocess teams in order to take the raw cellular products and integrate them into, for example, plant-based scaffolds, or use those cells as ingredients to make seafood products that you would really love to eat. So there are definitely a lot of challenges on the path to cultivated seafood. So coming from many different levels. So first, if we talk about the cells, actually getting cells to proliferate in a laboratory environment and to behave the way you'd like them to in a laboratory environment can be quite difficult and can take a lot of time. Luckily for us, marine species, so fish cells specifically, have the ability to spontaneously immortalize, which means that they can maintain their proliferative capacity over indefinite periods of time, but it takes a long time to get there, and we aren't always sure of the mechanisms that lead to this immortalization. So once you do end up having a population of immortalized cell lines, controlling their behavior further to, for example, differentiate them into muscle or fat or different cell types that could be useful for cultured meat, also requires very specific culture conditions and factors. And discovering these factors is first sometimes problematic, especially because a lot of the methods that exist in literature for differentiation of cells are really coming from a more biomedical research focus and aren't necessarily food compatible. Another problem is that marine species are actually quite neglected in the literature and in the previous biomedical research. Biomedical studies are much more focused on mammalian species such as humans, obviously, and mice, because we have nice mouse model systems. So you really see a lot more documentation about those species than you do about fish, which can be really difficult when you try to, look through all the work that's been done in the past and apply it to marine species. Sometimes it doesn't work the way you'd expect it to. So that's the cell side of the bottlenecks. I think another big bottleneck, especially for us in an industrial setting, is the bioprocess, because you do need to eventually have enough cells to feed the world at the end of the day. And getting there is really difficult because, these cells are small. especially for marine species, fish cells grow quite slowly. So their doubling time can be more than 3 days. So this is definitely something that we have to work on. And in this bioprocess, you need to also consider the costs of the materials that go into it. So for us at the moment, and I think for cultured meat across the board, the media cost is actually a huge bottleneck. So it costs about 96% of the production process, depending on who you ask and depending on what sort of species and processes you're working with, but generally in that range. And this cost is due in large part to the ingredients that are actually in the media. So in order to get the cells to behave the way you'd like them to in cultured conditions, you need to sort of trick them into thinking that they're still in physiologic conditions, meaning that you have to give them, vitamins, minerals, food sources, but also growth factors that tell them, okay, this is what you need to do now. It gives them the building blocks to be able to execute the programs that we'd like them to. And these growth factors can be really, really expensive if they're not animal derived. So I think bringing down the cost of those growth factors and at the same time bringing down the amount of media that needs to be used per, let's say, kilo of meat would be a great goal. And then another bottleneck is, of course, that this is a really novel food item. And it doesn't matter how much technological work we put in, it doesn't matter how many of these sort of technological barriers are overcome. At the end of the day, this has to be a product that people are not only willing but excited to eat and are excited to choose over a conventionally produced animal product. So in order to get there, you kind of need to break a lot of cultural ice, let's say, and make sure that people are trusting the process that the cultured meat comes from, and having a lot of reasons to buy it. So this has to be, a food that looks, tastes, smells great, and also is within the sort of purchasing power of most consumers. So across the board, a lot of challenges to overcome, but I think the field's making a lot of progress kind of in every silo and as well together. Particularly, I think the social aspect is really fascinating because the goal is, rather than with plant-based meats, the goal with cultured meat is that you end up having kind of a one-to-one swap out with your culturally relevant meat products. So as the consumer doesn't really have to think about it, you can just grab meat the same way you would grab any kind of meat and, use it the same way you always would. But then kind of counterintuitively, you do have a bit of a cultural barrier to break because it is a novel food that's not familiar to people, even though in the end the product will be very familiar to people. So it's a paradoxical situation. So really across the board, there need to be a lot of technological sort of advancements or applications of already existing technologies. So I'm a molecular biologist, and for me, I think a lot of the most interesting technological advancements that we could apply to cultured meat are in the cellular biology universe. So I think a lot of sort of tools that are available for engineering cells, so genetic modifications of cells, I think these are really underutilized in food production because of sort of consumer resistance to the idea of genetically modified foods. But at the end of the day, I think these are really, really safe modifications that can be made and would really allow us to unlock a lot of potential in this field, could help us accelerate and meet a lot of our goals and also exceed them, because I think one of the really great aspects of cultured meat is that you have full control of the final product. So this means that not only can you make, for example, fish that exactly matches a fish that you would like to buy in the supermarket, you can also make a fish that's better than the fish you want to buy in the supermarket. So you can have a fish that has a higher amount of, for example, omega-3 fatty acids. You can have a fish that delivers, that's fortified, so containing vitamin A, for example, or beta carotenes. And this ability to sort of tweak the cells to add additional value, this is something that we really could easily unlock with better application of genetic engineering. So I think that at the moment, the climate is very resistant to genetic modifications for foods, but I think we see this changing everywhere on Earth, especially in the US. I think it's really only a matter of time before the standards are are established that allow for these kinds of products to be more widely available around the world. And I think the consumer acceptance for it will also come with it as we establish, very transparent processes, and have sort of good public relations about these sort of technological topics. I think the consumer acceptance of those topics will come with that. So that's from the cell side. And I think technological advancements in terms of bioprocessing are also really necessary. At the moment, we do a lot of bioprocessing in the pharmaceutical industry with mammalian cells. So a lot of times you'll use their Chinese hamster ovary cells to produce drugs and biologics. And this is a very well-established industrial system, but it focuses on cells that are generally grown or that need to be adherent. So they need to be attached to some surface, either a bead floating around, or if they're not adherent, they're able to float in single cell suspension. And this large-scale bioprocess that hasn't really been adapted successfully to the cell types that you would see in meat. So I think some innovation in the bioprocessing is also probably necessary in order to get to the scales that we need to both feed the world and do it in a sort of cost-effective way. Well, I think the products that are being sold in Singapore right now are a really great example of how we can envision a lot of the sort of first generation products being sold. So that's very, very limited release in specific restaurants. And I think that we're getting closer and closer to this really every day as other countries start to approve their regulatory measures for labeling and marking these foods and approving them. I mean, you already see, for example, in Israel, there's a prototype. There's a restaurant that's attached to a cultured meat company, and they don't have the sort of regulatory approval to sell that product, but they do have the ability to let people try it after signing a waiver for free. So they're not paying for it, but they are just part of the sort of trial process for that company. And I think as Israel's regulatory process progresses, that's going to be sort of more standardized into like a more conventional restaurant experience. So I think, these sorts of things you're going to see first. And then in terms of estimating when you can see a product on supermarket shelves at price parity, this is a much more difficult question to answer, because that's really when you're able to sort of disseminate product at a large scale into supermarkets. That means you have a very high scale production. And I think a really big issue for culture meat at the moment is getting to that high scaled production. At the moment, we're operating on the scale of very small pilot and pre-pilot plants. And to increase the production to a point where you could actually, sell a product in a widespread way, it's I think going to be a while. And another thing is, as I was mentioning before, the regulatory process is really different region to region. Quite notoriously difficult to predict how those processes pan out, because they end up becoming very political, because there's a lot of pushback from different sort of lobbying agencies and different stakeholders. So I think it's difficult to put a finger on when you will actually be able to see this product, so culture meat products, at price parity on supermarket shelves. But I would say that the first ones you're going to see when that does eventually happen in, let's say, I would guess maybe more than 5 years, when you do see those products starting to appear, I think they're almost definitely going to be hybrid products with plant-based proteins. And this is because, of course, it's easier for the bioprocessing. It allows you to have more structure and better defined or easily defined structures. And we're really seeing a huge influx of support, both from the financial side, from the media side, from the consumer side, for plant-based meats. So I think integration with plant-based meats at the moment is really how I would imagine our field going for the short to medium term. So my vision for cultivated seafood is really, at the end of the day, that we don't rely on animals for our meat production at all, and not just seafood. So my vision is really for the whole cultured meat landscape at large, and also cellular agriculture. So this reliance on animals for our eggs and dairy and ingredients that come up in our pharmaceuticals and cosmetics. I think the long-term vision for me and for the field is for all of these to be developed not by animals, but rather by us in sort of by utilizing technology. For seafood in general, I think, yeah, it really is quite existential, the current way that we produce food, because as compared to growing livestock, where you have a sort of captive animal population and you're replenishing that population and taking away from it, in the case of seafood, you really are at risk of causing mass extinctions, and are already causing mass extinction events in our aquatic ecosystems as a result of overfishing. And it's more than just, fishing away all the animals that you would like to eat. It's also all the animals that are affected by bycatch. It's also all the pollution that's created by these fishing sort of fleets that are getting less and less efficient with time as they catch more and more fish, and therefore spending even more energy and resources in order to catch a smaller and smaller amount of fish. I think that there have been some attempts to solve some of these problems. So, for example, aquaculture, which is the industrialized farming of aquatic species. This was kind of a potential solution to the risk of overfishing, or rather inefficient fishing yields. And I think that this is actually a solution that is quite problematic and brought with it even more problems than it solved. So I think kind of bringing it back to Blue Biosciences. So just an interesting story about the fish cells that we use. These cells were developed by the Fraunhofer Institute for Marine Biotechnology to study disease propagation in aquaculture conditions. So there are cell lines that are derived from fish that are typically grown in aquaculture, like salmon. So when you buy a salmon, almost always it's not wild caught. It's coming from an aquaculture system. And I thought this was really interesting because it really identifies one of the huge problems of aquaculture, which is that these are, like any other industrialized farming situations where you have animals in such close proximity that disease is actually a huge risk, and increased pathogenicity is a huge risk. And that's a risk that sort of spills over into human well-being as well when you're eating these fish. So not only is it a risk to the animals that are in that system, it's also a risk to, us as consumers. And the other part of this aquaculture, of these aquaculture fish, is that a lot of times they're actually carnivorous. So that means that those fish need a really high protein diet in order to survive, and are oftentimes themselves fed other fish in order to maintain the aquaculture system. Yeah, and those other fish are always wild caught. So in the attempt to solve the problem of overfishing, you create aquaculture as an industry, and that industry still relies on fishing in order to sort of stay alive. So I think it's just a kind of great example of how problematic our current solutions to problems in seafood production are, and how they add, additional complications that didn't exist before, for example, pathogenicity in aquaculture. And I think it's just a great example of how cultivated seafood and cultured meat can step in to solve a lot of these problems by, removing animals from the equation entirely, and therefore, sort of saving a lot of the problems that come with animal production, and while also making products that could be, so much better for human health and well-being.